Shalom. This week's Parashat Vayakhel presents a challenge to any darshan, any sermonizer or rabbi who wants to talk about the parasha. Indeed, in a recent book by Hillel Hauken, A Complicated Jew, there's a chapter in which he surveys the weekly portions, and then he writes, "This week was Pikudei, the last Torah reading of Exodus. Before it came Vayakhel. Together they are two of the most tedious parshiot Shavua in the Chumash. Vayakhel relates how the Israelites built the tabernacle, etc. Pikudei, how they made the priest's vestments, etc. The commentators fall silent. What is there to add? And then, of course, he brings his own chidush, his own addition to those weekly portions. I believe that there are at least three things we can learn from Parashat Vayakhel. The first has to do with the status of women in Judaism. As you may know, in a few weeks, we will be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the first bat mitzvah of Judith Kaplan, the daughter of Rabbi Professor Mordechai Kaplan, which took place on March 18, 1922. And those who have made changes in Jewish practice regarding women during the past 100 years have looked for precedents. Well, a wonderful precedent appears in this week's portion, chapter 35. So the whole community of the Israelites left Moses' presence, and everyone who excelled in ability and everyone whose spirit moved him came bringing to the Lord his offering for the work of the tent of meeting, men and women, all whose hearts moved them. I'm skipping. And everyone who had in his possession X, Y, and Z, everyone who would make gifts of silver and copper, everyone who had in his possession acacia wood, and all the skilled women spun upon their own hands, and all the women who excelled in that skill spun the goat's hair. Thus the Israelites, all the men and women whose hearts moved them to bring anything for the work that the Lord through Moses had commanded to be done, brought it as a free will offering to the Lord. In other words, men and women equally contributed to the building of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, and this is presented in our Torah portion in a very egalitarian fashion. Indeed, Rabbi Dr. Tuvia Friedman pointed out in a wonderful article published about 40 years ago, the shifting role of women from the Bible to the Talmud, that in the Bible, we have many examples of women having a much stronger role in Judaism than they had in the Talmudic period. Furthermore, in my book, The Status of Women in Jewish Law, Responsa, in the introduction, I sketch 41 tachanot, 41 stations on the road to women having more and more roles in Judaism during the past 150 years. So the road from this week's portion led eventually to the bat mitzvah of Judith Kaplan and to many other areas in which women have a greater role in Judaism today than they did in the past. The second thing that we can learn from this week's portion is found in chapter 36. They took over from Moses all the gifts that the Israelites had brought to carry out the task connected with the service of the community. But when these continued to bring free will offerings to him morning and morning, all the artisans who were engaged in the tasks of the sanctuary came, etc., etc., etc. And what we learn from this is that the people who were collecting the money for the tabernacle, in addition to what they collected, they added their own gift. And this was stressed in a work called Imre Shefer, quoted in Iturei Torah, Vehem heviu elav od nedava baboker baboker. And they gave a contribution in the morning, meaning the people who were collecting the money also gave a contribution themselves. And Imre Shefer goes on to say, one of the problems with Askanim, with people who engage in Jewish public life, is they say, I give him my time. I don't have to give him my money. And Imre Shefer says, no. We learn from this portion of Vayakhel that those who collect money and those who lead the Jewish people must contribute money to the organizations which they support. And finally, the third lesson is found in one verse, which is found at the end of chapter 35, talking about Bezalel, the designer of the Mishkan. It says there in the Hebrew, Ulahorot Natan Belibo, and to give directions, he and Olihab, son of Achisamach of the tribe of Dan. But Lahorot in Hebrew can mean to give direction. It can mean to pasken halacha, to make halachic decisions. It can mean to teach. Well, Ibn Ezra says to us that it means to teach. And he says here, Ki esh chacham gam charash, lo yuchal lahorot etev. There are people who are wise, who have great skills in the area of arts and crafts, but they don't know how to teach others how to do that. The ideal in Judaism is, of course, to teach after learning, to learn in order to teach. So the story of Bezalel teaches us that not only did Bezalel know how to make beautiful things, but he also knew how to teach others to make beautiful things and to build the Mishkan. So from this boring Parsha of Vayakhel, we can learn about the egalitarian tendency of men and women in the biblical period. We can learn about the fact that each person who collects money for a good cause must also give money to that cause. And we can learn Shekol halomed chayav lelamed, whoever learns must also teach. Shavua Tov from Schechter.